Welcome back to another episode of Mike Reads. Today we'll be continuing our series on Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations with our fourth read in Book 4, Chapter 5, entitled Of Bounties. We are in our second read in the subsection entitled Digression Concerning the Corn Trade and Corn Laws. So to continue. After the business of the farmer, that of the corn merchant is in reality the trade which, if properly protected and encouraged, would contribute the most to the raising of corn. It would support the trade of the farmer in the same manner as the trade of the wholesale dealer supports that of the manufacturer. The wholesale dealer, by affording a ready market to the manufacturer, by taking his goods off his hands as fast as he can make them, and by sometimes even advancing their price to him before he has made them, enables him to keep his whole capital, and sometimes even more than his whole capital, constantly employed in manufacturing, and consequently to manufacture a much greater quantity of goods than if he was obliged to dispose of them himself to the immediate consumers or even to the retailers. As the capital of the wholesale merchant, too, is generally sufficient to replace that of many manufacturers, this intercourse between him and them interests the owner of a large capital to support the owners of a great number of small ones, and to assist them in those losses and misfortunes which might otherwise prove ruinous to them. An intercourse of the same kind universally established between farmers and the corn merchants would be attended with the effects equally beneficial to the farmers. They would be enabled to keep their whole capitals, and even more than their whole capitals, constantly employed in cultivation. In case of any of those accidents, to which no trade is more liable than theirs, they would find in their ordinary customer, the wealthy corn merchant, a person who had both an interest to support them and the ability to do it, and they would not, as at present, be entirely dependent upon the forbearance of their landlord or the mercy of his steward. Were it possible, as perhaps it is not, to establish this intercourse universally and all at once, were it possible to turn all at once the whole farming stock of their kingdom to its proper business, the cultivation of land, withdrawing from it every other employment into which any part of it may be at present diverted, and were it possible, in order to support and assist upon occasion the operations of this great stock, to provide all at once another stock almost equally great, it is not perhaps very easy to imagine how great, how extensive, and how sudden would be the improvement which this change of circumstances would alone produce upon the whole face of the country. The statute of Edward VI, therefore, by prohibiting as much as possible any middleman from coming in between the grower and the consumer, endeavored to annihilate a trade, of which the free exercise is not only the best palliative of the inconveniencies of a dearth, but the best preventative of that calamity. After the trade of the farmer, no trade contributing so much to the growing of corn as that of the corn merchant. The rigor of this law was afterwards softened by several subsequent statutes, which successively permitted the engrossing of corn when the price of wheat should not exceed 20, 24, 32, and 40 shillings the quarter. At last, by the 15th of Charles II, chapter 7, the engrossing or buying of corn in order to sell it again, as long as the price of wheat did not exceed 48 shillings the quarter, and that of other grain in proportion, was declared lawful to all persons not being forestallers, that is, not selling again in the same market within 3 months. All the freedom which the trade of the inland corn dealer has ever yet enjoyed was bestowed upon it by this statute. The statute of the 12th of the present king, which repeals almost all the other ancient laws against engrossers and forestallers, does not repeal the restrictions of this particular statute, which therefore still continue in force. This statute, however, authorizes in some measure two very absurd popular prejudices. First, it supposes that when the price of wheat has risen so high as 48 shillings a quarter, and that of other grain in proportion, corn is likely to be so engrossed as to hurt people. But from what has been already said, it seems evident enough that corn can at no price be so engrossed by the inland dealers as to hurt people, and 48 shillings a quarter besides, though it may be considered as a very high price, yet in years of scarcity, It is a price which frequently takes place immediately after harvest, when scarce any part of the new crop can be sold off, and when it is impossible even for ignorance to suppose that any part of it can be so engrossed as to hurt the people. Secondly, it supposes that there is a certain price at which corn is likely to be forestalled, that is, brought up in order to be sold again soon after in the same market, so as to hurt the people. But if a merchant ever buys up corn, either going to a particular market or in a particular market, in order to sell it again soon after in the same market, it must be because he judges that the market cannot be so liberally supplied through the whole season as upon that particular occasion, and that the price, therefore, must soon rise. If he judges wrong in this, and if the price does not rise, he not only loses the whole profit of the stock which he employs in this manner, but a part of the stock itself, by the expense and loss which necessarily attend the storing and keeping of corn. He hurts himself, therefore, much more essentially than he can hurt even the particular people whom he may hinder from supplying themselves upon that particular market day, because they may afterward supply themselves just as cheap upon any other market day. If he judges right, instead of hurting the great body of the people, he renders them a most important service. By making them feel the inconveniencies of a dearth somewhat earlier than they otherwise might do, he prevents their feeling them afterwards so severely as they certainly would do, if the cheapness of price encouraged them to consume faster than suited the real scarcity of the season. When the scarcity is real, the best thing that can be done for the people is to divide the inconveniencies of it as equally as possible through all the different months and weeks and days of the year. The interest of the corn merchant makes him study to do this as exactly as he can, and as no other person can have either the same interest or the same knowledge or the same abilities to do it so exactly as he, this most important operation of commerce ought to be trusted entirely to him. Or in other words, the corn trade, so far at least as concerns the supply of the home market, ought to be left perfectly free. The popular fear of engrossing and forestalling may be compared to the popular terrors and suspicions of witchcraft. The unfortunate wretches accused of this latter crime were not more innocent of the misfortunes imputed to them than those who have been accused of the former. The law which put an end to all persecutions against witchcraft, which put it out of any man's power to gratify his own malice by accusing his neighbor of that imaginary crime, seems effectually to have put an end to those fears and suspicions by taking away the great cause which encouraged and supported them. The law which should restore entire freedom to the inland trade of corn would probably prove as effectual as to put an end to the popular fears of engrossing and forestalling. The 15th of Charles II, Chapter 7, however, with all its imperfections, has perhaps contributed more both to the plentiful supply of the home market and to the increase of tillage than any other law in the statute book. It is from this law that the inland corn trade has derived all the liberty and protection which it has ever yet enjoyed, and both the supply of the home market and the interest of the tillage are much more effectually promoted by the inland than by either the importation or exportation trade. The proportion of the average quantity of all sorts of grain imported into Great Britain to that of all sorts of grain consumed, it has been computed by the author of the Tracts upon the Corn Trade, does not exceed that of 1 to 570. For supplying the home market, therefore, the importance of the inland trade must be to that of the importation trade as 570 to 1. The average quantity of all sorts of grain exported from Great Britain does not, according to the same author, exceed the 1/30th part of the annual produce. For the encouragement of tillage, therefore, by providing a market for the home produce, the importance of the inland trade must be to that of the exportation trade as 30 to 1. I have no great faith in political arithmetic, and I mean not to warrant the exactness of either of these computations. I mention them only in order to show of how much less consequence In the opinion of the most judicious and experienced persons, the foreign trade of corn is then the home trade. The great cheapness of corn in the years immediately preceding the establishment of the bounty may perhaps, with reason, be ascribed in some measure to the operation of the statute of Charles II, which had been enacted about 25 years before, and which had therefore full time to produce its effect. A very few words will sufficiently explain all that I have to say concerning the other three branches of the corn trade. 2. The trade of the merchant importer of foreign corn for home consumption evidently contributes to the immediate supply of the home market, and must so far be immediately beneficial to the great body of the people. It tends, indeed, to lower somewhat the average money price of corn, but not to diminish its real value, or the quantity of labor which is capable of maintaining. If importation was at all times free, our farmers and country gentlemen would probably, one year with another, get less money for their corn than they do at present, when importation is at most times in effect prohibited, but the money which they got would be of more value, would buy more goods of all other kinds, and would employ more labor. Their real wealth, their real revenue, therefore, would be the same as at present, though it might be expressed by a smaller quantity of silver, and they would neither be disabled nor discouraged from cultivating corn as much as they do at present. On the contrary, as the rise in the real value of silver in consequence of lowering the money price of corn lowers somewhat the money price of all their commodities, it gives the industry of the country where it takes place some advantage in all foreign markets, and thereby tends to encourage and increase that industry. But the extent of the home market for corn must be in proportion to the general industry of the country where it grows, or to the number of those who produce something else, and therefore have something else, or what comes to the same thing, the price of something else, to give in exchange for corn. But in every country the home market, as it is the nearest and most convenient, so is it likewise the greatest and most important market for corn. That rise in real value of silver, therefore, which is the effect of lowering the average money price of corn, tends to enlarge the greatest and most important market for corn, and thereby to encourage, instead of discouraging, its growth. By the 22nd of Charles II, chapter 13, the importation of wheat, whenever the price in the home market did not exceed 53 shillings and 4 pence the quarter, was subjected to a duty of 16 shillings the quarter, and to a duty of 8 shillings whenever the price did not exceed 4 pounds. The former of these two prices has, for more than a century past, taken place only in times of very great scarcity, and the latter has, so far as I know, not taken place at all. Yet, till wheat had risen above this latter price, it was by this statute subjected to a very high duty, until it had risen above the former to a duty which amounted to a prohibition. The importation of other sorts of grain was restrained at rates and by duties in proportion to the value of the grain almost equally high. Subsequent laws still further increased these duties. The distress which, in years of scarcity, the strict execution of those laws might have brought upon the people would probably have been very great. But upon such occasions, its execution was generally suspended by temporary statutes, which permitted, for a limited time, the importation of foreign corn. The necessity of these temporary statutes sufficiently demonstrates the impropriety of this general one. These restraints upon importation, though prior to the establishment of the bounty, were dictated by the same spirit, by the same principles, which afterwards enacted that regulation. How hurtful soever in themselves, these or some other restraints upon importation became necessary in consequence of that regulation. If, when wheat is either below 48 shillings the quarter, or not too much above it, foreign corn could have been imported either duty-free, or upon paying only a small duty, it might have been exported again, with the benefit of the bounty, to the great loss of the public revenue, and to the entire perversion of the institution, of which the object was to extend the market for the home growth, not for the growth of foreign countries. 3. The trade of the merchant exporter of corn of foreign consumption certainly does not contribute directly to the plentiful supply of the home market. It does so, however, indirectly. From whatever source this supply may be usually drawn, whether from home growth or from foreign importation, unless more corn is either usually grown or usually imported into the country than what is usually consumed in it, the supply of the home market can never be very plentiful. But unless the surplus can, in all ordinary cases, be exported, the growers will be careful never to grow more, and the importers never to import more, than what would bear the consumption of the home market requires. The market will very seldom be overstocked, but it will generally be understocked, the people, whose business it is to supply it, being generally afraid lest their goods should be left upon their hands. The prohibition of exportation limits the improvement and cultivation of the country to what the supply of its own inhabitants requires. The freedom of exportation enables it to extend cultivation for the supply of foreign nations. By the 12th of Charles II, Chapter 4, the exportation of corn was permitted whenever the price of wheat did not exceed 40 shillings the quarter, and that of other grain in proportion. By the 15th of the same prince, this liberty was extended till the price of wheat exceeded 48 shillings the quarter, and by the 22nd to all higher prices. A poundage, indeed, was to be paid to the king upon such exportation. But all grain was rated so low in the book of rates that this poundage only upon wheat to a shilling, amounted only upon wheat to a shilling, upon oats to a fourpence, and upon all other grain to a sixpence the quarter. By the 1st of William and Mary, the act which established the bounty, this small duty was virtually taken off whenever the price of wheat did not exceed 48 shillings the quarter. And by the 11th and 12th of William III, Chapter 20, it was expressly taken off at all higher prices. The trade of the merchant exporter was, in this manner, not only encouraged by a bounty, but rendered much more free than that of the inland dealer. By the last of these statutes, corn could be engrossed at any price for exportation, but it could not be engrossed for inland sale, except when the price did not exceed 48 shillings the quarter. The interest of the inland dealer, however, it has already been shown, can never be opposite to that of the great body of the people. That of the merchant exporter may, and in fact sometimes is. If, while his own country labors under a dearth, a neighboring country should be afflicted with a famine, it might be his interest to carry corn to the latter country in such quantities as might very much aggravate the calamities of the dearth. The plentiful supply of the home market was not the direct object of those statutes, but, under the pretense of encouraging agriculture, to raise the money price of corn as high as possible, and thereby to occasion, as much as possible, a constant dearth in the home market. By the discouragement of importation, the supply of that market, even in times of great scarcity, was confined to the home market, and by the encouragement of exportation, when the price was so high as 48 shillings a quarter, that market was not, even in times of considerable scarcity, allowed to enjoy the whole of that growth. The temporary laws prohibiting for a limited time the exportation of corn, and taking off for a limited time the duties upon its importation, expedients to which Great Britain has been obliged so frequently to have recourse, sufficiently demonstrate the impropriety of her general system. Had that system been good, she would not so frequently have been reduced to the necessity of departing from it. All right, that seems like a good place to stop. We will finish Book 4, Chapter 5 in our next read. So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.